Was it truly faith that drove hundreds of thousands from their homes, or was it something far more primal, masked by the shimmer of a holy cause? How could a single speech delivered in a field in France in November of 1095 unleash 2 centuries of controlled access warfare, reshape empires, and leave scars still visible in the 21st century? When Pope Urban II addressed the council at Clermont, he spoke of liberation for Eastern Christians and remission of sins for those who took up arms. Curiously, historical accounts suggest he never used the specific words crusade or cross, yet the response was immediate and explosive, far exceeding his expectations. It was as if he had struck a match in a room filled with dry tinder and gunpowder. The tinder was the desperate European populace, gripped by poverty, overpopulation, and a profound fear of eternal damnation following a millennium of anxieties. The gunpowder was the ambition of the knightly class, a group of professional warriors with diminishing opportunities for land and glory at home. Urban offered them all a single revolutionary idea, a war that was not a sin but a penance, a pilgrimage armed to the teeth. But before the organized armies of princes and dukes could even sharpen their swords, the idea escaped containment. It infected the masses, led by figures like Peter the Hermit, a charismatic ascetic who claimed divine inspiration. This was the first anomaly. The plan called for professional soldiers, but the first wave consisted of peasants, women, children, and petty criminals, an unruly torrent convinced that God would protect them. They believed faith alone could part seas and topple city walls. They were catastrophically wrong. The so-called Peasants' Crusade, or People's Crusade, erupted in the spring of 1096, several months ahead of the official departure date for the Knights. It was less a military campaign and more a chaotic migration fueled by millennial hysteria. Peter the Hermit and his contemporary Walter Sans Avoir, Walter the Penniless, gathered tens of thousands of followers. Their journey began not with strategic planning, but with a terrifying outburst of violence directed closer to home. As these bands moved through the Rhine Valley, the concept of fighting distant infidels blurred with pre-existing anti-Semitic sentiment. In cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, the Crusaders offered local Jewish communities a brutal choice: conversion or death. Thousands were massacred, despite attempts by local bishops to protect them. These pogroms were the first blood spilled in the name of the cross, a chilling precedent demonstrating how easily theological fervor could be channeled into opportunistic slaughter. The Crusaders who committed these atrocities saw no contradiction. They were purifying Christendom as they marched to save it. For them, any non-Christian was an obstacle to God's plan. This initial wave of violence set a dark tone for the entire enterprise. It proved that once unleashed, religious zealotry recognizes few boundaries drawn by its originators. When these disorganized masses finally reached the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexios Komnenos was horrified. He had requested elite mercenaries to fight the Seljuk Turks, not a starving, undisciplined mob that pillaged his countryside. Emperor Alexios, a master of diplomacy and survival, quickly ferried the volatile crowd across the Bosporus Strait into Asia Minor, urging them to wait for the professional armies. But patience was not a virtue possessed by the followers of Peter the Hermit. Convinced of their divine mandate, they pushed inland, deeper into territory controlled by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The initial encounters were deceptively easy, as they overwhelmed small, unprepared Turkish villages. Emboldened, they split their forces. One group captured the fortress of Zerigordos, only to be besieged by the resurgent Turks under Sultan Kilij Arslan. The Crusaders inside faced a grim choice: die of thirst or surrender, and convert to Islam. Most surrendered. Those who refused conversion were executed. The main force encamped near Civito was lured into a meticulously planned ambush. On October 21st, 1096, the Seljuk army descended upon the largely unarmed pilgrims. The result was not a battle, it was a massacre. Thousands were cut down in minutes. Walter Sans Avoir fell among them. Peter the Hermit, conveniently, was back in Constantinople, negotiating supplies at the time of the disaster. The People's Crusade disintegrated on the fields of Anatolia, its participants either dead or sold into slavery. This catastrophe served as a brutal lesson. Divine approval, real or imagined, was no substitute for armor, discipline, and logistics. The dream of a spontaneous popular victory had evaporated. The stage was now cleared for the professionals, the iron fist of feudal Europe, who were already marching east, driven by motives far more complex than simple piety. They carried not only crosses but also calculations of power, land acquisition, and dynastic ambition. The age of chaos was ending, the age of systematic war was about to begin. This distinction between popular fervor and professional application of force would define the next 200 years. The failure of the People's Crusade highlighted the chasm between religious idealization and military reality. While the poor sought spiritual salvation and immediate relief from suffering, the knights and nobles who followed sought tangible rewards layered beneath the spiritual justifications. They understood that conquering Jerusalem required more than prayer. It required siege engines, supply lines, and ruthless strategy. The news of the peasants' annihilation in Anatolia did not deter the princely armies gathering across Europe. If anything, it reinforced their sense of purpose and superiority. They were the true chosen instruments of God's will, not the undisciplined rabble. The first wave had tested the waters and confirmed the enemy's strength. Now the second wave, the true First Crusade, would bring the full force of Western chivalry to bear upon the Levant. The leaders of this endeavor were not saints, they were hardened warriors, jealous rivals, and ambitious rulers. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was pious, but also sought to escape a complicated political situation at home. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy, viewed the East as an opportunity to carve out a kingdom for himself, having been denied inheritance by his father. Raymond IV of Toulouse was the wealthiest and most powerful of the leaders, driven by genuine piety but also by a fierce determination not to be outdone by his rivals. The Crusade presented an unparalleled opportunity for these men to gain land, wealth, and spiritual merit simultaneously, a perfect fusion of earthly desire and heavenly command. The logistical challenge of moving tens of thousands of heavy cavalry, infantry, and non-combatant support staff across Europe was unprecedented. Unlike the disorganized stream of peasants, the princely armies moved with greater discipline, yet their presence still strained the resources of the lands they crossed. The relationship with Emperor Alexios Komnenos in Constantinople remained fraught with tension. Alexios demanded oaths of fealty from the Crusader leaders, requiring them to return any formerly Byzantine lands they captured from the Turks. The Crusaders, particularly Bohemond, were reluctant. They had not marched thousands of miles to become vassals of the Byzantine emperor. They agreed to modified oaths, but the seeds of mistrust between Latin West and Greek East were firmly planted. In 1097, this combined force, estimated to be between 30,000 and 60,000 strong, crossed into Asia Minor. Their first major target was Nicaea, the capital of Kilij Arslan, the same sultan who had annihilated the People's Crusade. This time, however, the result was different. The Crusaders possessed sophisticated siege equipment and military discipline. The siege lasted for more than a month. In a brilliant move of combined operations, Alexios's Byzantine forces blockaded the city from the lake while the Crusaders assaulted the walls. The city ultimately surrendered to the Byzantines, not the Crusaders, denying the Franks the opportunity to plunder it. This move secured the city for Alexios but further infuriated the Crusader leaders, who felt cheated of their victory spoils. Following the capture of Nicaea, the Crusaders began the grueling march across the Anatolian plateau during the height of summer. Kilij Arslan, having learned from his easy victory over the peasants, prepared a massive ambush near the ruins of Dorylaeum on July 1st, 1097. He attacked the vanguard of the Crusader army, led by Bohemond. The lightly armored Turkish horse archers swarmed the heavily armored knights, employing hit-and-run tactics. For hours, Bohemond's forces endured a relentless barrage, forming a defensive perimeter. The situation grew desperate until the main body of the Crusader army, led by Godfrey and Raymond, arrived. The combined Christian forces crushed the Seljuk army in a pitched battle. The victory at Dorylaeum was pivotal. It broke the back of Seljuk resistance in western Anatolia and opened the path south towards Syria. However, the victory came at a high cost, and the journey that followed tested the limits of human endurance. The army traversed a harsh, arid landscape where food and water were scarce. Men and horses died in droves from starvation and thirst. The bonds of discipline frayed as desperation set in. It was during this brutal trek that the internal rivalries among the leaders intensified. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, left the main army with a small contingent to pursue his own ambitions in Cilicia, and eventually captured the city of Edessa, establishing the first Crusader state. He did not continue to Jerusalem. The ultimate test for the First Crusade arrived at the gates of Antioch in October 1097. Antioch was one of the ancient patriarchates of Christianity, a massive city with formidable walls that seemed impregnable. The siege dragged on for 8 agonizing months. The Crusader camp suffered from relentless rain, disease, and severe famine during the winter. Morale plummeted, desertions increased, knights who had set out in splendor were reduced to boiling leather straps for sustenance. It was here that the Crusaders faced not only the enemy without, but also the demons within. The siege was only broken by betrayal. Bohemond of Taranto secretly contacted an Armenian tower commander named Firuz, who agreed to let the Crusaders into the city in exchange for wealth and status. In June 1098, Bohemond led a small group up the walls, opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured into Antioch, slaughtering the Muslim and, in the confusion, Christian inhabitants. But their triumph was short-lived. Just days later, a massive relief army led by Kaboga of Mosul arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. Trapped between the citadel, which still held out, and Kaboga's forces outside, the Crusaders faced annihilation. Starvation returned with a vengeance. It was in this moment of ultimate despair that a poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross. After much digging in the cathedral, a piece of metal was produced. Whether genuine relic or timely fabrication, its effect on morale was electric. Filled with renewed religious fervor, the emaciated Crusader army marched out of Antioch to face Kaboga's much larger force. Against all odds, they routed the Muslim army, whose internal divisions proved fatal. The victory at Antioch was seen as definitive proof of divine favor. Yet the campaign's brutality reached its nadir shortly afterward. As the army marched south, they besieged the town of Ma'ara. After capturing it, the starving Crusaders resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the bodies of the slain Muslim defenders. Chroniclers of the time recorded these events without flinching, attributing the horror to the extremity of their hunger. This incident, though horrifying, demonstrated the complete desensitization to violence that had occurred over the course of the campaign. The goal of liberating the Holy Sepulchre now justified any action, no matter how depraved. Finally, in June 1099, the depleted but hardened remnants of the First Crusade stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city was well defended by its Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla. The Crusaders, numbering perhaps only 12,000 effective soldiers by this point, launched a desperate assault. After weeks of constructing siege towers and facing shortages of wood and water, they breached the walls on July 15th. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders, overcome by bloodlust and religious ecstasy after years of hardship, slaughtered nearly everyone inside the city, Muslims and Jews alike. Chronicles describe streets running deep with blood. Men, women, and children were killed in mosques, synagogues, and homes. Godfrey of Bouillon, soon to be named Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, reportedly walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to give thanks, his path cleared through piles of corpses. The capture of Jerusalem was hailed in Europe as a miraculous triumph, the fulfillment of God's plan. But for those living in the newly conquered territories, the victory was merely the beginning of a precarious existence. The Crusaders established 4 states in the Levant, collectively known as Outremer, or the Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These states were inherently fragile, existing as small Christian islands in a vast Muslim sea. They were ruled by a Frankish minority governing a diverse population of local Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The fundamental challenge for Outremer was survival. It depended entirely on a constant influx of pilgrims, resources, and warriors from Europe, thousands of miles away. The initial zeal that fueled the First Crusade began to wane once the primary objective was achieved, leaving the settlers in a state of perpetual vulnerability. To defend these fledgling states, new institutions were required. The roads connecting coastal ports to inland holy sites like Jerusalem were infested with bandits and subject to raids by Muslim forces. Pilgrims who arrived seeking salvation often found martyrdom instead. It was out of this practical necessity for defense that a revolutionary concept emerged: the military order. The most famous of these was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. Founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugues de Payens and 8 companions, their initial mission was simple: to protect pilgrims on the dangerous road from Jaffa to Jerusalem. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living as monks, yet their primary duty was warfare. This fusion of monasticism and militarism was radical. The Templars, headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, quickly gained papal endorsement and attracted vast donations from across Europe. They became an elite fighting force, often representing the only standing army available to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Simultaneously, the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or the Hospitallers, evolved. Originally founded before the Crusade to care for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, their role expanded rapidly to include military defense. Like the Templars, they became a powerful, wealthy, and independent organization. These orders built and garrisoned some of the most formidable castles in history, such as Crac de Chevalier and Margat, marvels of medieval military architecture designed to withstand long sieges and control vast territories with minimal manpower. These fortresses were the backbone of Crusader defense, projecting power far beyond the cities. Life in Outremer developed a unique hybrid culture. The Franks adopted local customs in dress, food, and hygiene while maintaining their European feudal structures. Intermarriage occurred, though less frequently than romantic literature suggests. However, this coexistence was always overshadowed by the looming threat of jihad, or holy war, from the Muslim side. For the first few decades, the Crusader states benefited from the disunity of their Muslim neighbors. The Seljuk Empire was fragmented, and local emirs in Syria and Mesopotamia were often more concerned with fighting each other than uniting against the Franks. However, the presence of an aggressive Christian state in their midst eventually acted as a catalyst for Islamic reunification. The concept of jihad, which had lain relatively dormant, was reinvigorated as a political and religious tool to expel the invaders. The turning point came with the rise of Imad ad-Din Zangi, the powerful Turkish Atabeg, governor of Mosul and Aleppo. Zangi was a ruthless and ambitious military leader who dedicated himself to rolling back Frankish gains. He skillfully combined military force with propaganda, presenting himself as the champion of Islam against the infidels. In 1144, Zangi targeted Edessa, the northernmost and weakest of the Crusader states. The city was relatively isolated and its count, Jocelyn II, was absent. Zangi laid siege to Edessa and, after a month of brutal fighting, captured it. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. It was the first major loss for the Crusaders, proving that their hold on the Holy Land was not secure. The news reached Europe and sparked calls for a new crusade, a massive relief effort to reclaim the lost territory and reinforce the remaining states before they too were overwhelmed by the rising tide of Muslim power. The success of the First Crusade had created a sense of invincibility. The fall of Edessa shattered it. The fall of Edessa prompted Pope Eugene III to issue the bull Quantum Predecessores, officially calling for a second crusade in 1145. To give the call maximum impact, the Pope enlisted the most influential man in Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot, a theologian of immense intellect and charisma, considered by many to be a living saint. When Bernard preached the crusade, he did so with overwhelming force. At Vézelay in France, his sermon reportedly moved the crowd so profoundly that they ran out of cloth for crosses, forcing Bernard to tear his own robes into strips. Unlike the First Crusade, which was led by princes and lower nobility, the Second Crusade attracted royalty. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany took the cross, marking the first time European monarchs personally led such an expedition. This royal participation raised expectations to extraordinary heights. If princes could conquer Jerusalem, surely kings could reclaim Edessa and secure the Levant indefinitely. However, the involvement of kings brought with it royal egos, national rivalries, and complex political baggage that ultimately proved disastrous. The venture seemed cursed by arrogance and poor planning from the very beginning. Conrad and Louis, distrustful of each other, decided to march their massive armies separately through Eastern Europe and Anatolia. The march through Anatolia, the same territory crossed by the First Crusaders, became a recurring nightmare. King Conrad III's German army, moving first, was less disciplined than its reputation suggested. As they entered Seljuk territory in October 1147, Conrad split his forces. He led the main body of knights and infantry himself, while sending his non-combatant followers along a safer coastal route. Near Dorylaeum, the site of the First Crusade's great victory, Conrad's army marched directly into a trap set by the Seljuks. The German heavy cavalry proved ineffective against the mobile Turkish horse archers in the broken terrain. The Germans suffered catastrophic losses. Conrad himself was wounded by arrows. Barely escaping with a fraction of his army, he retreated to Nicaea, where he waited for the French. The French army, led by Louis VII and accompanied by his formidable wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, fared little better. Though initially more cautious, they too were subjected to relentless harassment by Turkish forces. At Mount Cadmus in January 1148, the French vanguard marched too far ahead of the main column, leaving the baggage train and pilgrims exposed. The Turks attacked in the resulting gap, inflicting massive casualties on the disorganized French. Louis only avoided capture by climbing a rock and fighting off attackers single-handedly. Humiliated and depleted, the remnants of both royal armies eventually abandoned the overland route and took ships from Adalia to Antioch, leaving most of their infantry behind to be slaughtered by the Turks. When the bedraggled kings finally reached the Crusader states, the original objective, recapturing Edessa, was quietly abandoned. Edessa was too far away, mostly destroyed, and strategically less important to the southern kingdoms than reinforcing their own borders. The leaders gathered at the Council of Palmyra near Acre to decide on a new target. Against all logic and sound advice from the local barons of Outremer, they chose to attack Damascus. This decision ranks among the greatest strategic blunders of the crusading movement. Damascus was ruled by the Burid dynasty, which had historically maintained a pragmatic alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem against their common enemy, the Zangid dynasty in Aleppo and Mosul. By attacking Damascus, the Crusaders not only alienated their only significant Muslim ally, but also effectively forced Damascus into the arms of Nur ad-Din, Zangi's son and successor. The siege of Damascus in July 1148 was a fiasco. The Crusaders initially made good progress, positioning themselves in the dense orchards west of the city. However, disputes immediately arose among the leaders about who would rule Damascus after its capture. Jealousies between the European newcomers and the established nobility of Outremer poisoned the atmosphere. The local barons felt their advice was being ignored by arrogant kings who knew nothing of local politics. After only 4 days, following rumors of Nur ad-Din's approaching relief army and internal betrayals that led the Crusaders to move their camp to a less advantageous position without water, the siege collapsed. The Christian army retreated in disgrace. The failure of the Second Crusade was total and humiliating. Not only did it fail to achieve any military objectives, but it significantly worsened the strategic position of the Crusader states. Nur ad-Din capitalized on the blunder, eventually taking control of Damascus in 1154, thereby unifying Muslim Syria under a single, powerful ruler dedicated to jihad. Back in Europe, the search for scapegoats began. Bernard of Clairvaux faced criticism for promoting a failed venture, defensively arguing that the Crusaders' sins, not God's plan, caused the defeat. The debacle poisoned enthusiasm for large-scale crusades for a generation. It demonstrated that royal leadership did not guarantee success, and that the complexities of Levantine politics were beyond the comprehension of visiting European monarchs. The Second Crusade stands as a monument to arrogance, poor leadership, and the destructive potential of inter-allied conflict. It left Outremer weaker than ever, paving the way for the rise of a leader who would unite Egypt and Syria and achieve what Zangi and Nur ad-Din had only dreamed of: the almost complete destruction of the Frankish presence in the Holy Land. This man's name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. His consolidation of power in the decades following the Second Crusade created the perfect storm that would necessitate a response from Europe's greatest warrior king. So, what truly destroyed the Second Crusade? Was it the military prowess of the Turks, or was it the internal rot of pride and rivalry among the Christian leaders themselves? Let us know in the comments whether you believe failure comes from external force or internal division. The vacuum created by the failure of the Second Crusade allowed Nur ad-Din to consolidate power in Syria, but the true prize lay further south, Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was decadent and collapsing, plagued by internal power struggles. Nur ad-Din dispatched his Kurdish general Shirkuh to intervene in Egyptian politics. Accompanying Shirkuh was his young nephew Saladin. Through a series of brilliant maneuvers and assassinations, Saladin eventually outmaneuvered all rivals and became the effective ruler of Egypt in 111 and 69. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved to seize control of Syria, uniting Egypt and most of Muslim Syria under his single rule by 1183. The Crusader states were now encircled by a unified, powerful, and charismatic leader who possessed both vast resources and a genuine commitment to holy war. Saladin's rise coincided with a period of internal decay within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Baldwin IV, the leper king, was a courageous and capable ruler despite his affliction, but his illness meant his reign was destined to be short, leading to factionalism between the court party, which favored diplomacy with Saladin, and the war party, which advocated aggression. The war party, led by figures like Raynald of Châtillon and Guy of Lusignan, repeatedly violated truces with Saladin, most notoriously when Raynald attacked a Muslim caravan, allegedly capturing Saladin's own sister. This provocation gave Saladin the perfect justification to launch an invasion. The decisive moment came in 1187. Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias, hoping to lure the main Crusader army into open battle. Against the advice of Raymond of Tripoli, King Guy of Lusignan marched the entire army of the kingdom across a waterless desert in the middle of summer to relieve the siege. Saladin trapped the exhausted and dehydrated Crusader army near the horns of Hattin. On July 4, 1187, Saladin set fire to the dry brush surrounding the Christian camp and then attacked. The result was an unmitigated disaster for the Crusaders. The Frankish infantry broke ranks seeking water, and the knights were overwhelmed. The army was annihilated. King Guy was captured, and Saladin personally executed Raynald of Châtillon. The battle also resulted in the capture of the True Cross, the most sacred relic in Outremer. Hattin effectively destroyed the military capability of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. With no army left to oppose him, Saladin swept through the kingdom, capturing castle after castle. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem itself surrendered to Saladin. In stark contrast to the Crusader massacre of 1999, Saladin acted with magnanimity. He allowed most Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave peacefully, preventing a general slaughter. This act of clemency cemented his reputation in both the Muslim world and Europe as a chivalrous and merciful ruler. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe, arguably more profound than the fall of Edessa. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news. Pope Gregory VIII immediately called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, to recover the Holy City. This call mobilized the three most powerful monarchs in Christendom: Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip II Augustus of France, and King Richard I, the Lionheart, of England. Frederick Barbarossa, despite his advanced age, led a massive German army overland. He successfully defeated Turkish forces in Anatolia, but drowned while crossing the Salef River in 1190. His army largely disintegrated after his death. Richard and Philip, bitter rivals, travelled by sea. Richard, stopping first to conquer Cyprus, established a crucial supply base for future operations. The kings arrived at the ongoing siege of Acre. Acre had become the focal point of Christian resistance, besieged by the remnants of the Crusader forces since 1189. The siege was a brutal 2-year affair, marked by intense fighting, rampant disease, and stalemates where Christian besiegers were themselves besieged by Saladin's relief army. The arrival of Richard and Philip with superior siege technology finally tipped the balance. The city surrendered in July 1191. The victory was immediately tainted when Richard, frustrated by delays in the prisoner exchange negotiations with Saladin, ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children. This act of cold-blooded cruelty stained Richard's reputation, standing in sharp contrast to Saladin's recent mercy at Jerusalem. After the fall of Acre, Philip Augustus, feigning illness and eager to return to France to scheme against Richard's territories, abandoned the crusade. This left Richard in sole command. The Lionheart then began one of the most remarkable campaigns of the medieval period. His objective was to march south along the coast to capture Jaffa, the port necessary for launching an attack on Jerusalem. Saladin's forces relentlessly harassed Richard's army during the march, employing tactics designed to break the Crusader formation. Richard enforced strict discipline, forbidding his knights from breaking ranks to chase the elusive horse archers. The confrontation culminated at the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191. As Saladin launched an all-out assault, Richard's rearguard, particularly the Hospitallers, counterattacked without orders. Richard quickly capitalized on the moment, ordering a full charge that shattered Saladin's army. Arsuf was a significant tactical victory. It proved Saladin's field army could be beaten by Richard's forces and secured the coast for the Crusaders. However, Richard the Lionheart, the brilliant tactician, proved to be a cautious strategist. He advanced inland towards Jerusalem twice, but both times he hesitated and turned back. He understood that while he might be able to capture Jerusalem, holding it with depleted forces and vulnerable supply lines would be impossible once Saladin regrouped. The internal politics of England, where his brother John was plotting against him, also demanded his return home. The Third Crusade ended in stalemate. Richard and Saladin, two iconic adversaries who reportedly developed a grudging respect for one another, negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. The treaty left the Crusaders in control of a narrow coastal strip from Acre to Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Saladin agreed to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims safe passage to visit the Holy Sepulchre. Richard left the Holy Land shortly thereafter, never to return. Saladin died only months later, in 1193. While the Third Crusade failed to recapture Jerusalem, it succeeded in saving the Crusader states from complete annihilation. It re-established a viable Frankish presence in the Levant that would survive for another century. Yet the cost was immense, and the central prize remained elusive. The legend of Richard and Saladin would overshadow the military reality, a brutal war between two formidable leaders that ended not with epic victory, but with pragmatic compromise. The failure to reclaim the Holy City ensured that the call for crusade would sound again, but the next major attempt would stray so far from its original purpose that it would forever tarnish the movement's ideals. The lesson learned by some strategists was that to defeat Saladin's successors, one had to strike at the heart of their power, Egypt. This strategy, however, required immense capital and naval power, placing the future of the crusade in the hands of merchants rather than kings. The failure to recapture Jerusalem during the Third Crusade weighed heavily on Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and politically astute popes in history. Innocent envisioned a perfectly organized crusade that would avoid the mistakes of the past. He correctly identified Egypt as the center of Ayyubid power, conquer Cairo, and Jerusalem would fall as a consequence. To achieve this, a massive fleet was required to transport the army directly to the Nile Delta, bypassing the treacherous overland route through Anatolia. In 1198, Innocent called for the Fourth Crusade. Knights from France, Flanders, and Germany eagerly took the cross, led by powerful nobles like Theobald of Champagne and Boniface of Montferrat. The problem, as always, was funding and logistics. The Crusaders contracted with the Republic of Venice to build and provision a fleet capable of transporting over 30,000 men and thousands of horses, an enormous industrial undertaking for the time. The price tag set by Venice was staggering, 85,000 silver marks. The Crusaders agreed to pay the full amount before departure. However, by the summer of 1202, when the crusading army gathered in Venice, they faced a critical shortfall. Far fewer knights had arrived than anticipated, and they could only raise about 2/3 of the agreed-upon sum. The army was trapped on the Lido island, unable to proceed and deeply indebted to the Venetians. Enter Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. Dandolo was over 90 years old and blind, but possessed a razor-sharp political mind and an unwavering dedication to Venetian commercial interests. Seeing an opportunity in the Crusaders' predicament, Dandolo proposed a deal. He suggested that Venice would defer the remaining debt if the Crusaders first assisted them in capturing the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. There was one significant complication. Zara was a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the cross. The proposal was to divert a holy war intended to fight infidels to attack fellow Christians for Venetian profit. A significant portion of the army was appalled by the idea, and Pope Innocent explicitly forbade it under threat of excommunication. However, the leadership felt they had no choice. Trapped and bankrupt, they agreed to Dandolo's terms. In November 1202, the Crusader fleet besieged Zara. The city fell quickly. Pope Innocent duly excommunicated the entire crusade, though he later absolved the Franks while maintaining the excommunication of the Venetians. The diversion to Zara was a cynical maneuver, but it was merely the prelude to an even more profound betrayal of the crusading ideal. While wintering in Zara, the Crusaders were approached by messengers bearing an extraordinary offer from Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus. Isaac had been overthrown and blinded by his own brother, who now ruled as Emperor Alexios III. Young Alexios promised the Crusaders enormous wealth, 200,000 silver marks plus military support for the crusade in Egypt and, most alluringly, the submission of the Greek Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome if they would sail to Constantinople and restore his father to the throne. For Dandolo and the Venetians, this was an irresistible opportunity to settle old scores with Byzantium and gain commercial dominance in the East. For many Crusaders, particularly the leadership, the offer solved all their financial problems and presented a seemingly legitimate reason to divert to Constantinople. The deep-seated mistrust between Latins and Greeks, exacerbated during previous crusades, made the idea of disciplining the schismatic Greeks palatable. Despite strong opposition from some quarters, the leaders agreed. In 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the walls of Constantinople, the largest and wealthiest city in Christendom. The initial assault was successful. The Venetians breached the sea walls and Emperor Alexios III fled the city. Isaac II was released from prison and recrowned, with young Alexios Angelos crowned as co-emperor Alexios IV. The Crusaders had fulfilled their part of the bargain. However, Alexios IV quickly discovered that the imperial treasury was empty and that the anti-Latin sentiment in the city made raising taxes impossible. He could not pay the Crusaders what he owed. Tensions escalated throughout the winter as the Crusaders encamped outside the walls, waiting for payment that never came. In early 1204, a palace coup led to the murder of Alexios IV and the rise of a new anti-Latin emperor, Alexios V Doukas Murtzouphlos, who immediately demanded the Crusaders leave Byzantine territory. The Crusaders now felt betrayed and legally justified in taking payment by force. They drew up a formal treaty, the Partitio Romaniae, dividing the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves before they had even captured it. On April 12, 1204, they launched an all-out assault on Constantinople. After fierce fighting, the defenses broke and the Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was 3 days of unrestrained pillage, slaughter, and desecration that horrified the contemporary world. The Crusaders, driven by greed and religious animosity, plundered palaces and churches. Priceless classical and Byzantine artworks were destroyed or melted down for their metal. Relics were stolen and shipped back to Western Europe. The Great Library of Constantinople was burned. Witnesses described soldiers drinking from chalices in Hagia Sophia, placing prostitutes on the Patriarch's throne, and murdering civilians indiscriminately. The sack of Constantinople effectively destroyed the heart of Eastern Christendom. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted for little more than half a century before the Greeks reclaimed their capital. The Fourth Crusade never reached Egypt or the Holy Land. It succeeded only in fatally weakening the Byzantine Empire, leaving it vulnerable to final conquest by the Ottoman Turks 2 centuries later. The schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches became an unbridgeable chasm of hatred. The ideal of crusade had fully degenerated from a war for faith into a naked enterprise of greed and political conquest, a dark stain from which its reputation would never truly recover. The moral catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade seemed to shatter the very logic of the movement, leading to increasingly bizarre manifestations of religious zealotry in the 13th century. If professional knights led by kings and funded by republics could fail so spectacularly, or be corrupted so thoroughly, perhaps God required a different kind of warrior. This sentiment gave rise to one of the most tragic and misunderstood episodes of the era, the Children's Crusade of 1212. This event was not a single organized march, but rather 2 separate, spontaneous popular movements originating in France and Germany. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed that Christ had appeared to him and given him a letter for the King of France, authorizing him to lead an army of innocents to the Holy Land. He preached that the Mediterranean Sea would part before them, allowing them to walk to Jerusalem. Thousands of young people, primarily adolescents and young adults, the term pueri in Latin could mean children, but also simply low-status youth, flocked to his banner. They marched south through France, their numbers dwindling due to starvation and hardship. When they reached Marseille, the sea, predictably, did not part. Unscrupulous merchants offered to transport them to the Holy Land for free. Several ships foundered in a storm. Survivors who reached North Africa were allegedly sold into slavery. A parallel movement occurred in the Rhineland, led by a German youth named Nicholas of Cologne. He led thousands over the Alps into Italy, believing in a similar miracle. The group fractured upon reaching the Italian coast. Some tried to sail from Genoa, others went to Rome, where Pope Innocent III, moved but practical, gently told them to return home until they were older. Few ever made it back to Germany. The Children's Crusade, whether viewed as an outburst of pure faith or mass delusion, ended in utter tragedy, demonstrating the fatal consequences of naive belief meeting harsh reality. While popular enthusiasm devolved into tragedy, official crusades continued, still fixated on the Egyptian strategy. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, assembled a large army from across Europe. The plan, once again, was to capture a key Egyptian port, and trade it for Jerusalem. The Crusaders successfully besieged and captured the port city of Damietta in the Nile Delta in 1219 after a grueling 18-month siege. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, was so concerned by the loss that he offered remarkable peace terms. He would return Jerusalem and most of the former kingdom, including the True Cross, in exchange for the Crusaders leaving Egypt. The secular leaders of the crusade, including King John of Brienne, were eager to accept. However, Pelagius of Albano, the papal legate leading the expedition, refused. Driven by religious maximalism and overconfidence, Pelagius believed they could conquer all of Egypt. He rejected the offer and ordered the army to march on Cairo in 1221. The decision was catastrophic. Al-Kamil, an intelligent strategist, waited until the Nile flooded in late summer. He broke the dikes, trapping the Crusader army in a rising torrent of water and mud. Cut off and starving, the army was forced to surrender. They returned Damietta to Al-Kamil simply in exchange for safe passage out of Egypt. The Fifth Crusade had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, undone by clerical arrogance and a refusal to compromise. The repeated failures left Christendom exasperated and created an opportunity for one of the most fascinating and contradictory figures of the Middle Ages, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Frederick was brilliant, cultured, spoke multiple languages including Arabic, and ruled from Sicily, where Norman, Greek, and Arab cultures intermingled. He was also deeply skeptical of papal authority and had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX for repeatedly delaying his promise to go on crusade. Finally, in 1228, Frederick sailed to the Holy Land while still under the ban of excommunication, an act unprecedented in itself. A crusader excommunicated by the Pope leading a holy war created a paradox that infuriated Rome. Frederick, however, had no intention of fighting a bloody campaign. He understood the political landscape far better than previous leaders. Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt was currently embroiled in a power struggle with his relatives in Syria and needed a temporary truce on his western front. Frederick, leveraging his knowledge of Arabic and diplomacy, began direct negotiations with al-Kamil. In February 1229, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were astonishing. Al-Kamil ceded Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Frederick, effectively restoring the core holy sites to Christian control. The city walls of Jerusalem were to remain dismantled, and the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, would stay under Muslim administration. Frederick marched into Jerusalem and crowned himself king. He had achieved through negotiation what two major crusades costing thousands of lives and vast fortunes had failed to achieve through force. The irony was bitter for the papacy. The heretic emperor had succeeded where the pious had failed. However, this diplomatic victory was fragile. The local military orders like the Templars opposed the treaty, viewing it as a shameful compromise. The truce was only for 10 years, and once it expired, the underlying tensions that led to Hattin would inevitably resurface. This era presents a stark contrast in methods. You have the pure faith of the Children's Crusade ending in tragedy, and the cynical diplomacy of the excommunicated emperor succeeding where faith failed. Which approach, even in failure, do you find more compelling? Idealistic fervor or pragmatic calculation? Share your choice in the comments below. Frederick II's diplomatic coup proved ephemeral. The peace he negotiated lasted little more than a decade. In 1244, Khwarezmian mercenaries, displaced by the Mongol invasions in Central Asia and allied with the Egyptian Sultan, stormed Jerusalem and recaptured it. The city's defenses had never been rebuilt as per Frederick's treaty, making its fall swift and brutal. This loss, coupled with a subsequent devastating defeat of the Frankish army at the Battle of La Fourby, once again placed Outremer on the brink of extinction. The response came from a monarch who was the antithesis of Frederick II, King Louis IX of France. Louis was genuinely pious, ascetic, and later canonized as a saint. He viewed the crusade not as a political tool, but as his ultimate Christian duty. After a severe illness during which he pledged to take the cross, Louis began meticulous preparations for what would become the Seventh Crusade. He spent 4 years gathering funds and supplies, determined to succeed where others had failed by applying overwhelming resources and unwavering faith. Like Innocent III and the Fifth Crusade, Louis targeted Egypt. He landed near Damietta in 1249 and captured the city relatively easily as the Ayyubid defenders fled in panic. The initial success seemed to vindicate Louis's pious approach. However, the Crusades soon bogged down. The army waited months in Damietta for reinforcements and for the Nile flood to subside. During this time, discipline eroded and disease spread. In late 1249, Louis began his march toward Cairo. The Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt was crumbling, but in its place, a new and formidable military force was emerging, the Mamluks. Mamluks were originally slave soldiers primarily of Turkic origin from the Eurasian steppe, purchased young, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained in warfare. They formed the elite corps of the Egyptian army. At the Battle of Mansoura in February 1250, the French vanguard, led by Louis's reckless brother, Robert of Artois, charged prematurely into the town. They were trapped in the narrow streets and annihilated by the Mamluk defenders. The main army under Louis subsequently found itself trapped in a disastrous stalemate. Disease, particularly scurvy and dysentery, ravaged the French camp. Louis himself fell gravely ill. As the army attempted to retreat back to Damietta, they were surrounded by Mamluk forces. King Louis IX, too sick to stand, was captured, along with the remnants of his army. It was a humiliation on par with the Fifth Crusade's failure. Louis was eventually ransomed for an enormous sum and the return of Damietta. He spent the next 4 years in the Holy Land, strengthening fortifications like Caesarea and Acre, but he lacked the manpower to launch any new offensive campaigns. His personal sanctity had failed to overcome military reality. The failure of Louis's crusade had profound consequences in Egypt. During the chaos of the campaign and the negotiations for Louis's release, the Mamluks staged a coup, murdered the last Ayyubid sultan, and seized power for themselves in 1250. This marked the birth of the Mamluk Sultanate, a regime ruled by former slaves that would become one of the most powerful and ruthless empires in the Mediterranean. The Mamluk objective regarding the Crusader states was simple and absolute: total eradication. The new sultanate could not tolerate the continued existence of Frankish enclaves, which they viewed as beachheads for future European invasions. The most fearsome Mamluk leader to emerge was Baybars, a brilliant general who had played a key role in defeating Louis at Mansoura. Baybars ruled from 1260 to 1277, and he waged a systematic, relentless war of annihilation against Outremer. Baybars was a master of siege warfare and psychological terror. He methodically captured one Crusader fortress after another. In 1265, he took Caesarea and Arsuf, massacring the garrisons. In 1268, he captured the mighty city of Antioch, ending its existence as a Crusader state and slaughtering or enslaving tens of thousands of inhabitants. He specifically targeted the military orders, understanding they were the backbone of Frankish defense. In 1271, Baybars besieged Crac de Chevalier, arguably the most powerful castle in the world. After a short siege, the Hospitaller garrison surrendered under false pretenses of safe conduct, only to be imprisoned or killed. Despite the deteriorating situation in the Levant, King Louis IX, now back in France, remained obsessed with his crusading vow. He organized a new expedition, the Eighth Crusade, in 1270. However, influenced by his brother Charles of Anjou, who had interests in Sicily and North Africa, Louis directed the crusade not against Egypt or the Holy Land, but against Tunis. The rationale was ostensibly to convert the Hafsid Emir of Tunis and create a base for operations against Egypt, though Charles likely had more pragmatic economic motives. The crusade landed near ancient Carthage in July 1270, during the height of summer. The camp quickly succumbed to disease in the poor sanitary conditions. Dysentery swept through the army. Louis himself contracted the illness and died on August 25, 1270. His death effectively ended the crusade before it began. The passing of St. Louis marked the end of large-scale royal crusades to the east. The remaining Crusader strongholds were now living on borrowed time, facing the full, undivided attention of the Mamluk war machine, which operated with brutal efficiency and an iron will to finish the job started by Saladin. The final act for Outremer was approaching rapidly, and it would be a bloody conclusion to 2 centuries of conflict. The death of Louis IX extinguished the last flickering ember of large-scale royal support for crusading in the Levant. The remaining cities of Outremer, now reduced to a narrow coastal strip centered on Acre, descended into political chaos. Rival merchant communes from Venice and Genoa fought pitched battles in the streets for commercial control, while the military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights bickered over dwindling resources and strategy. The leadership vacuum was total. Meanwhile, the Mamluk Sultanate, having consolidated its power under successors to Baybars like Qalawun, prepared for the final assault. Qalawun viewed the internal squabbles of the Franks as a sign of terminal weakness. In 1289, he captured the county of Tripoli, massacring its population. The final target was Acre, the capital and last major bastion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In April 1291, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Qalawun's son, arrived before Acre with one of the largest armies ever assembled in the medieval Middle East, equipped with an enormous train of sophisticated siege engines, including massive trebuchets capable of leveling city walls. The city's defenders, numbering perhaps 15,000 against an army estimated at over 100,000, prepared for a desperate last stand. The siege lasted for 6 weeks, marked by heroic but futile sorties from the knights and relentless bombardment by Mamluk artillery. The final assault began on May 18, 1291. Mamluk forces breached the outer walls and poured into the city. The defense collapsed into street-by-street fighting and a panicked rush to escape via the sea. Chroniclers describe horrific scenes of overloaded boats capsizing in the harbor as desperate civilians tried to flee. The Templar master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded. The remaining Templars retreated to their massive fortress compound on the edge of the sea, holding out for several more days before it too fell when Mamluk sappers undermined its foundations. The fall of Acre was followed by a swift Mamluk campaign to mop up the remaining coastal cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut. By August, every trace of Frankish rule on the mainland had been erased. The 200-year experiment of Outremer was over. Survivors fled to Cyprus, which became the new base for the displaced orders, but the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem from a Levantine foothold was dead. The fall of Acre sent shockwaves through Europe, but this time there was no massive new crusade in response. There was exhaustion, recrimination, and a search for scapegoats. How could God allow this final catastrophic failure? Suspicion fell upon the military orders, particularly the Knights Templar. They were immensely wealthy, powerful, operated as a transnational corporation largely independent of royal control, and now lacked their original purpose. This combination of wealth and vulnerability made the Templars a perfect target for King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Philip was a ruthless centralizer of royal power, constantly in need of funds to finance his wars with England and Flanders. He viewed the Templars' vast assets within France as an untapped resource and their autonomy as a threat to his authority. Beginning around 1305, Philip's agents began circulating dark rumors about the order. They claimed that during secret initiation ceremonies, knights were forced to deny Christ, spit on the cross, engage in homosexual rituals, and worship an idol head known as Baphomet. These accusations, almost certainly fabricated, combined elements of heresy and sexual deviancy calculated to inspire maximum public outrage. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip launched a coordinated dawn raid across France, arresting thousands of Templars, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay. The operation was executed with stunning secrecy and efficiency. The knights were subjected to systematic torture by royal inquisitors. Under duress, many confessed to the charges leveled against them. Pope Clement V, himself heavily influenced by Philip, initially resisted but eventually buckled under pressure, issuing the papal bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their own lands. The subsequent trials lasted for years, a mixture of political maneuvering and theological debate. Despite many knights later recanting their forced confessions, claiming innocence, the fate of the order was sealed. In 1312, Pope Clement dissolved the Knights Templar through administrative decree, transferring most of their property to the Hospitallers, though Philip ensured a significant portion found its way into royal coffers. The climax of the Templar tragedy occurred in March 1314. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, and Geoffrey de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were brought before a commission in Paris to receive sentences of life imprisonment. Instead, they recanted their confessions, proclaiming their innocence and the purity of the order. An enraged King Philip ordered them burned at the stake as relapsed heretics that very evening. Legend holds that from the flames de Molay cursed King Philip and Pope Clement, summoning them to appear before God's judgment within a year. Pope Clement died only a month later, and King Philip died in November of the same year from a hunting accident. While likely a later invention, the legend captured the dramatic end of the crusading era's most iconic institution. The destruction of the Templars marked the psychological end of the classical crusade. The idea of holy war itself had not only failed militarily in the East, but had turned inward, consuming its own champions in a fire of greed, paranoia, and state power. The crusading ideal, born in a fervor of piety at Clermont, died in the streets of Acre and the interrogation chambers of Paris. The physical loss of the Holy Land did not, however, extinguish the concept of the crusade. The idea proved too potent, too useful as a tool for political mobilization, to simply disappear. Instead, it transformed, adapting to new contexts and justifying new conflicts far removed from Jerusalem. The crusading framework was immediately reapplied with greater intensity to ongoing conflicts within Europe itself. The Reconquista in Spain, the centuries-long struggle by Christian kingdoms to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, adopted the full spiritual and legal apparatus of crusading. Papal bulls granted crusader indulgences to those fighting in Spain, effectively equating the war against the Moors with the war for the Holy Land. Similarly, the Northern Crusades saw German and Scandinavian powers wage brutal campaigns against pagan populations in the Baltic region. Groups like the Teutonic Knights, originally founded in Acre, shifted their focus to Eastern Europe, carving out a state through conquest under the banner of converting pagans by force. The ideology of crusade provided a divine sanction for territorial expansion and colonization. Even after the Reformation split Christendom, the rhetoric endured. When European powers began their great age of exploration and colonial expansion, the justification for conquering new lands often mirrored crusading language, bringing civilization and Christianity to native populations, whether they desired it or not. The mentality that underpinned the assault on Jerusalem in 1099 found new expression in the subjugation of the Americas and Africa. The term crusade itself retained a powerful, almost mystical resonance in Western culture. It evolved into a metaphor for any struggle pursued with moral certainty and righteous zeal, stripped of its specific theological context, but retaining its emotional weight. In the 20th century, leaders readily invoked the term for ideological struggles. Dwight Eisenhower titled his memoirs of the Second World War Crusade in Europe, framing the fight against Nazism as a battle between absolute good and absolute evil. In the 21st century, following the attacks of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush's initial description of the response as a crusade immediately sparked controversy, demonstrating the term's lingering and toxic legacy, particularly in the Middle East. For many in the Arab and Muslim world, the Crusades are not a distant medieval event, but the foundational act of Western aggression and imperialism. This historical narrative, whether entirely accurate or not, is actively used by modern extremist groups to recruit followers and justify violence against the West, presenting contemporary conflicts as a continuation of Saladin's fight against Richard the Lionheart. The 2 centuries of war in the Levant created fault lines between cultures that have proven remarkably persistent. The Crusades failed to secure Christian control of the Holy Land, fatally weakened Eastern Christianity, and poisoned relations between civilizations for generations. Looking back across 9 centuries, the Crusades stand as a monumental case study in human contradiction. They represent the apex of medieval faith and the depths of human cruelty, a time when thousands were willing to sacrifice everything for spiritual salvation, yet committed terrible sins in its pursuit. The central paradox remains: how did an idea intended to protect pilgrims and liberate holy sites morph into a justification for massacring Jews in the Rhineland, cannibalizing enemies in Syria, and sacking the greatest Christian city in the world? The answer lies not in a single flaw, but in the volatile chemistry between absolute conviction and temporal power. When faith provides an irrefutable justification for violence, it grants permission for avarice, ambition, and intolerance to march under a holy banner. The knights who took the cross sought forgiveness for their sins, but in the process often lost their humanity. The legacy of the Crusades is not just in the castles crumbling in the desert sand or the art stolen from Constantinople. It is embedded in the very idea that a higher purpose can sanction actions that would otherwise be considered monstrous. For 2 centuries, men tried to build a kingdom of heaven by force of arms, only to unleash hell on earth. Their tragedy warns that great ends rarely justify brutal means, for the means themselves inevitably corrupt the end. This historical epic, stretching over generations, reveals a fundamental human vulnerability. The desire for absolute certainty in a chaotic world is powerful. The temptation to divide humanity into us and them, believers and infidels, is perennial. The Crusades show that when this division is armed with weapons and blessed by authority, the potential for catastrophe is limitless. The echoes of these ancient wars linger in modern political rhetoric, in territorial disputes, and in the deep-seated mistrust that fuels contemporary conflicts. The core question posed by the Crusades remains unanswered by time. We are still a species drawn to grand narratives of righteousness, often quick to justify force in the name of our highest ideals. Consider the world around you today, torn by conflicts where each side claims the moral high ground, convinced of its own sacred mission. History offers a stark choice. Will we repeat the pattern, pursuing righteous ends through violent means, risking the same cycle of destruction? Or can we learn from the blood-soaked sands of Outremer that true strength lies not in the certainty of our convictions, but in the difficult, often painful, search for common ground with those we believe to be profoundly wrong? The final choice, as always, rests not in history books, but with those who live in the present. Looking back at this 200-year saga of faith, ambition, and bloodshed, we must decide what lesson to draw. What will shape our collective future? The seductive call of ideological certainty that demands conflict, or the difficult path of human compromise that requires understanding? Write your choice in the comments. Your perspective helps define the legacy we build from these ancient ashes.